Hello, my name's Roisin, and I love a book club. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the books that I think would be excellent for you to read with your book club. These are just 10 books that I'm going to talk to you about today. However, when I was coming up with this list of books that I think would be great to read with your book club, I came up with like 30 suggestions. So if you would like a part 2, please let me know in the comments down below, and I will keep recommending you books for your book club. I am in a book club myself, and whilst I love it and I love thinking of books to read, it can be quite tricky because usually when you're picking a book for a book club, you won't have read the book yourself already, so you can't guarantee it's going to be a book that will be good for discussion. So that is where these recommendations come in. If you are struggling to look for a book for your book club, hopefully I will have some here that you haven't yet read and sound really interesting for you. My criteria when choosing these books were not that they were my favourite books ever, although the 10 books I'm going to recommend to you today, I did enjoy all of them very much, but that they had something meaty in them, some different topics and ideas, different styles of writing that I think would really benefit a good discussion. Some of these books were a little divisive. I've heard people love them and people who dislike them, which I think can really make for a great discussion. You can really talk about why you liked things or what it was specifically that you disliked. And that is the main goal for book club. When you read a book that everyone just thinks, yeah, that was a nice experience, but there's not a huge amount to discuss, then your book club just becomes drinking wine with your friends, which, you know, is fun, but it is not the aim of a book club. Or maybe it is the aim of your book club, in which case, just pick any book and don't talk about it. My other requirements when picking books for this video was that they weren't too long. I think that different people have different reading speeds, and you usually meet your book club once a month, maybe every 6 weeks. And some people are super busy, some people have lots of other reading to do for their work or for their university, and some people just read slower. And so you want to pick a book that everyone will be able to finish. I also picked books here that, while they do have interesting writing, aren't super experimental and inaccessible, because I think that it's important that your book doesn't feel like a chore or work for everyone to read. So there aren't a huge amount of classics, for example, on this list, or anything that is a super experimental prize winner. For I work in a library and I actually run the book groups with a couple of other people at my library. And I know people complain when they've read things like The Milkman, because although it is a really well-praised book, it is not necessarily accessible for everyone. So I've tried to keep these to be good, literary, interesting books with lots to discuss that aren't too long and aren't too inaccessible. So that's my list of requirements. Let's get into the books. The first one that I'm going to recommend is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. Girl, Woman, Other is probably a very popular book club book after it won the Booker and was shortlisted for the Women's Prize. But I think that it is much more experimental than Mr. Loverman. There is no punctuation in Girl, Woman, Other, and I think that makes it kind of less accessible. I also personally preferred Mr. Loverman, but that's just a personal taste thing. Mr. Loverman tells the story of Barrington, a man in his 70s who came over to the UK as part of the Windrush generation from Antigua. And he has been in a relationship with his best friend since they were 14 years old, but he is also married to a woman, and he has, in 2010, decided that he can no longer be closeted and wants to come out. We are inside his head, going through his thought process, his feelings, his fears, as he is thinking about coming out. But it is also interspersed with chapters that throw back to Antigua and his getting married to his wife. And in that time period, we're seeing things from his wife's perspective, and we're understanding how their relationship got to be so toxic and damaging to both of them, and the misogyny and the homophobia that is present in their lives throughout. It is a book that is light and funny, I would say, but still manages to deal with some really serious topics. And it would be a really interesting discussion to talk about unlikable characters, or how characters can get you on their side even when they are doing things that you don't agree with, about sympathy. And also it would be interesting to discuss things like Windrush and misogyny and homophobia, and being closeted, and also cycles of abuse, because this is a book that's a lot about family. Barrington has 3 daughters and also some grandchildren, and we can talk about intergenerational wealth and privilege and how that relates to race and class. So there are a lot of discussions I think that could be had off of the back of reading Mr. Loverman. The second one I have on my list is another one that I think probably is a book group favourite, and that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. This one is one of those books that is very divisive. A lot of people love it and a lot of people hate it. In fact, when I read it with my book group, there were only 3 of us, but 2 of us gave it 5 stars and the other one didn't finish it because she disliked it so much. So I think that that is really ripe for discussion. Normal People tells the story of Connell and Marianne, 2 teenagers growing up during the financial crisis, the global financial crisis that hit particularly hard in Ireland, and they live in rural Sligo. Marianne is a middle-class girl from a well-off but very emotionally abusive family who is very unpopular at school, and Connell is from a working-class family. His mother, in fact, cleans Marianne's house, but he is popular in school and very focused on his image and his social standing, and they end up getting into a secret relationship, and then they both go off to Dublin to go to Trinity College, and it's kind of their experience of their lives through this relationship. It is a very slow moving book where not a lot happens, but it is very, very character driven and very internal. I think there are loads of discussions to be had about class and about rural versus urban life. There is also discussions to be had about gender and about sex. There's a lot of sex in this book, so it could be triggering for that reason, as well as it's a book that very much focuses on mental health. So there's stuff about eating disorders and stuff about male mental health and depression. And so I think that there are lots of discussions to be had for that reason. It is a beautifully written book, and one that I felt myself was really fast paced. Like, I got through it very, very quickly. It took me less than 24 hours to read this book. And although I'm someone who reads a lot, I think that it would not take someone who was not a reader very long to get through this either. It is also one that had a TV series made of it, which I think makes it A, more popular, and B, also more accessible. The third book on my list is by another Irish writer, and that is Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. This one is probably the least accessible out of all the ones on my list in terms of writing style. It is definitely much more experimental, but it is a very short book and a very beautiful, moving book, which I think can help to get past some of the more almost dialect that it's written in that could be a struggle. Days Without End tells the story of Tomasz McNulty, another boy from Sligo, actually, who fled Ireland during the famine, lost all his family to the famine, and fled to Canada and then into America as a refugee, and then ends up conscripted into the army fighting the Indian Wars and in the Civil War. And so it is about colonialism. This book is very much about colonialism. It is about the experience of what happened in Ireland during the famine, although that is only tangentially mentioned, but then it is also about colonialism in America. It talks about the differences between colonialism of the colonization of the Irish and then the Irish involved in the colonization of America, and it also talks about how a lot of the members of who fought in the Civil War, both on the Union and the Confederate side, were Irish boys fighting one another. It is also a queer love story and talks about ideas of gender. So it is one with a lot packed in there, and it's also about human resilience and hope, and there is that in there too. So there is a lot to discuss in this book about its structure, about its language, about the way that it uses dialect and the way that it uses beautiful descriptive language to talk about really horrific things. There is, as I mentioned, the discussion of colonialism, of dehumanization, and you could discuss how Tomasz got involved and what about his lack of choices, as well as about gender and gender presentation in the 1850s, which I think is a really interesting perspective to have. Next, the only one that I actually have a physical copy of is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and this is the only classic on my list. It is, as you can see, very, very short, which I think makes it perfect for a book club, because although it is a classic and therefore a little more dense, and perhaps you would have to read at least the introduction in here to get a little more understanding of the historical context in which it is being written, it's very short, so it shouldn't take you too long to read, even if you do read the introduction and do a little bit of reading around it, which I think is always helpful for classics, particularly considering that this is a Nigerian classic, and so as well as history, culture is also an important thing to understand when you are reading this. This tells the story of Okonkwo, who is an Igbo, who's high up in an Igbo tribe in Nigeria before it was called Nigeria. He is thought of as the greatest warrior of the tribe, and we see his life before contact is made with the British colonizers, and in the village, all of the things that lead to his life falling apart. We see it's very much about Igbo culture and about the complexity of culture pre-colonialization, because this book was written in some ways in response to white colonialists writing about Africa, as if it was completely had no culture before the colonizers invaded. This talks about Igbo culture, but it also talks about gender. There's a lot about gender, and the neutral tone of the narrator really allows you to read into it for yourself. It doesn't offer any judgment either way. It also talks about missionaries in Africa, and then also colonizers in Africa, and the imposition of British law, and how that, because it talked about Igbo law in the earlier part of the book, so it has a lot of contrast between those two things without really the tone of the narrative lending a judgment. You can bring your own judgment to the book, which I think is one of the things that makes this really powerful to read. I think it makes quite a different read from those of us who have been used to reading the white English canon, and so I think that can make for a good discussion as well. What makes a classic? Why is this considered a classic? And what can be considered a classic. Then I would also recommend Sing, Unburied, Sing by Jessmyn Ward, which tells the story of Jojo and his mother Leonie as they go to prison to collect his father, who has been put in prison there. And it is set in Mississippi in the 2010s, I think, so it's very much a contemporary novel, but it also has elements of fabulism and of historical fiction, because we hear about Jojo's father, who is a white man, is a prison that his grandfather was also in 50 years before as a young black boy. And so this is a very slow moving book. Again, there is not a huge amount of plot, like they go to the prison and then they come back from the prison, but we hear from both Jojo and Leonie's perspective, and also from about the history of his grandfather, who is Pop or Rivers, depending on who is talking. An incredibly beautifully written book, and does a really good job of writing from different perspectives. He's very specifically focused on this family of inherited trauma because of what happened to Leonie's brother, and also because of her own drug addiction. It does a really good job of making well-rounded characters, because we see them from multiple different perspectives, and the way that their intentions are different than their impact, I think, is a really important part of this book. Also inherited trauma, and also, of course, racism and incarceration as the legacy of slavery are very important themes in this book as well, which I think can make for a great discussion. The parts that are from Leonie's perspective are almost written by like a prose poem, and there is also elements of song and of oral tradition that comes through in this book, particularly in one of the perspectives, and I think that again can be a very interesting way to talk about form and about storytelling, and about who gets to tell stories, which I think is again one of the important aspects of this book. I will leave some links in the description, because there has recently been another killing of an unarmed black man in America, so I will leave some links in the description. Next, I would recommend If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, which is a book set in South Korea about 5 women, and it is kind of about the beauty industry in South Korea. These 5 women who live in the same building and how their lives are interconnected. It is a book that is really sharply ironic and really like dry humour involved in it, but there is a lot of disconnect, which I think could be to some people's taste and not to others. It flickers between 4 different perspectives, although there are 5 main characters. One is a girl who has been mute, we know, because of a trauma she experienced, although we don't know at the beginning of the book what that trauma is. And one of the other people involved is her roommate, who wishes to get cosmetic surgery in order to be a room salon girl. One of the other girls is one of these room salon girls from like the high class room salon, and it talks about sex work in Korea and also about plastic surgery in Korea through that perspective. We also have a woman who is an artist who is from the same orphanage as one of the other girls, but who become, through her time in New York, entangled with the upper echelons of Seoul society, and so we can see the differences in class as well being discussed in this novel, of the hyper-capitalist, hyper-consumerist culture of Seoul as well. Everything is a commodity, and then the other perspective is of a woman who is slightly older, who lives downstairs from these girls, who wants to be a mother. And so again, we have the perspective of motherhood in Korea, and women in careers in Korea, women and work in Korea, and career advancement, and the expectations, gendered expectations in Korea, but also relevant to the rest of the world, although it seems to be heightened in Korea, at least, or heightened in this novel. So there are, again, a lot of different discussions to be had, but it's definitely a book where you could discuss feminism and women's rights a lot. That I think those are the things that would really come up, as well as the commodification of humans, I think is a big theme in this novel, and it is one that is very, very quick read and very, very accessible, but that makes it less complex, and we see like sort of an older side of Korea, and then also very modern aspects of it. The drinking culture in Korea, there's so many things that are a part of this novel that seems on the surface to be just a sort of sharply witty commentary on just 5 young women in South Korea. So I think that there is so much to unpack there, and we can also, as if you are not from Korea, then there you can see how those themes relate to your own personal lives or to your own experiences. Number 7 on my list is Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jerdovski. So this is a piece of historical fiction, although it is very recent historical fiction. It is set in the 1980s in Poland, and it is about 2 boys who meet in a summer camp in Poland. So during this time, under the communist rule of Poland, university students had to farm basically in order to graduate, and these 2 boys meet at this farm, and they are reading James Baldwin, and they fall in love, and then they go in, after the summer, they go in different directions, and it's about their relationship, and it's about gay relationships when that is not allowed, and sneaking around, and also it is very much about late communism in Poland. It's about class and about education, but it is also about, like, one of the boys kind of gets involved in the resistance, but not in a very active way. He's quite passively involved, about the fall of communism and late communism, but it's about people's relationships to the party and to survival, and how you survive under communism, about how such a strict controlling state, the effects that has on your life. It's a book that seems, again, very slow moving, like there's not a lot happening, but there is a lot going on under the surface, and it is really, really beautifully written, really captivating, and I think, again, because there's so much to discuss, would be really good for a book club. Number 8 on my list is The Bass-Rock by Evie Wyld. This is a book that's split between 3 different perspectives. We have a woman in the 17th century who has been accused of being a witch. We have a woman in the 1950s who has married a man who has 2 sons, and she's become their stepmother, and they've gone to live in this house in Scotland where they can see the Bass-Rock off the coast, and it is an abusive relationship. And then we have her great niece, I think, who is going and unpacking her house and finding out about her past, and this niece is also going through a very bad mental health time, and so from that you can see there is a lot already to discuss. This is a book that is very much about violence against women, so I think if you were struggling with that, or needed a trigger warning for that, it might not work for your book club for that reason, but there are trigger warnings for some of the other books in this list as well, like Unburied, if you are not up for reading about police violence right now. In terms of The Bass-Rock, this book again is one that feels a lot of slow moving. There is definitely witchy elements to it, and I think that the discussion of witches, madness and women is something that I think there can be a lot of interesting discussions about. It is another book that I think is quite divisive. Some people have really loved it and some people have liked it less, which I think is always productive for a great discussion. Flash between these different perspectives, but there are also little vignettes of pieces of violence against women that have happened in this house. So it is all sort of focused on this area of Scotland. And there is a lot about like secrets and family secrets, which I think can be discussed. And this book has such a powerful narrative pull, which I think can be great for people who are used to reading more like thrillers, that sort of thing. There is kind of almost a mystery, as something to figure out, something dark happening that you're trying to work out what happened through the perspective of the woman it's happening to and the woman who is her niece, but then there is also the earlier perspective, which is tied in towards the end, and so you've got that kind of what's happening, why are these 3 stories being told alongside one another, which I think could be an interesting discussion for a book group. Another one that I think would make interesting discussion is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue, which I think particularly would make an interesting discussion now because it is a book about a pandemic. It is about the 1918 flu epidemic in Dublin, and it is set on a maternity ward specifically for women who are close to their due date who also have the 1918 flu. And it is set over the course of 3 days. Our main character is Nurse Powers, but there is also a female doctor who was involved in the 1916 uprising, and a skivvy who has never worked in a hospital before called Birdie. And it is about, there is a lot of graphic descriptions of birth and of health, but it is also about Irish history and the history of women's health, particularly in Ireland, the treatment of women as brood mares, and also about the Magdalen laundries and the schools run by nuns and things like that. So it's a lot about the treatment of women and children in Ireland, and about those who've sinned, and it is also about poverty There's also a queer relationship in here. So again, I think it's one that is beautifully written but in a very accessible way, and I think that would pull a lot of people onwards who want to find out what's going to happen to these people, and because there is the ever-present danger that you're going to die of flu, and there is also a lot of relevances to our current pandemic and how medicine hasn't moved on that much. Lots of cleaning your hands and wearing masks, which I think could make, again, for an interesting discussion if you feel capable of reading about a pandemic right now. And it's another one, it's because it's historical fiction, can teach you a lot about history, particularly if you didn't know much about Ireland and Magdalene laundries and that sort of thing. I think that that could be an interesting jumping off point to discuss those sort of things. And then the final one that I have on this list is Queenie by Candice Carty Williams. This is another book that is divisive. I know lots of people really, really love it, including myself, but other people didn't get on with it so much. And as I've already mentioned, I think that that makes for a really interesting discussion. Queenie tells the story of Queenie, a young black woman growing up in London, working in publishing, I believe, and she is going through a lot with her mental health. She is just broken up with at the beginning of the book, and it is about her like romantic relationships, her relationship to sex, also her familial relationships, her inherited trauma, and her own trauma, and about the way that Caribbean cultures talk about mental health, I think, is a big one in here, particularly, and mental health in general, and particularly Queenie's relationship to sex and to men. Again, violence against women is a very big part of this book, but it is the one that is most like walks the line between commercial and literary fiction, which I think makes it more accessible for people who are more used to reading commercial fiction. But there's a lot to talk about in this book in regards to consent, in regards to race, and in the workplace. There is a lot of different facets that I think could spark a really interesting discussion for your book group. So there you go, those are 10 books that I think would be really, really good to discuss with your book group. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of them with a book group, or if you are going to. I would love to hear what you think. If you would like a part 2 with more books that I think would be great to read with your book group, let me know that in the comments below as well. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos 3 times a week, so I'll be here again very soon. Bye bye!